Hello everyone. My name is Elise. Welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing so good today. We are doing one of the most exciting videos of the year to do because it's the best books of the year so far. And I have 10 books that I'm going to be talking about today. It just so happened that I had exactly 10 books that I had given 5 stars. I don't talk about ratings a lot on my channel, like star ratings. I do occasionally, but I do keep them in my story graph so I can kind of sort at different points of the year of what some of my favorite books have been and some of my least favorite. So I know for myself, but these are all 5-star books. And yeah, we're gonna go ahead and get into them today. I will do a quick disclaimer that most of the time I'm gonna be putting up a picture of the book. That is because I'm currently on crutches, and if you've been here before, you may know that most of my read books I keep in our basement. These are my TBR. Well, some are my husband's books, but the ones that are mine here are my TBR mostly. And the rest are downstairs in boxes, and I am not in a state to be able to go and get them. So we're just gonna have to deal with the pictures today, which is sad because I definitely want to show off these books, but you'll still get to see them. So that's why there's going to be a lot of photos. I have 2 books here that I recently read. So if you've been watching the recent wrap-ups, you might recognize. So those ones I'll be able to show, but yeah. With all that said, we'll go ahead and get into the book. So I did rank these. So take that for what you will. I think my best book is definitely my best book. Some of the ones in the middle, it's like, who knows? But these are my top 10 books of the year so far in 2023. So starting at number 10, we have a sequel that I read this year, and that is Assassin of Reality. This is by Marina and Sergey Dyachenko, and it's translated by Julia Meitov Hersey, I believe, from the Russian. And this is published by Harper Voyager. So I loved Vita Nostra. I read it several years ago now. I thought it was absolutely fantastic. It's one of those books that is very confusing, but you just don't care. You're along for the ride anyway. And it takes place at a magical school, kind of, but it's much darker than maybe some other magical schools, and the students are basically forced to be there against their will and are being blackmailed to complete their studies. And if they don't complete their studies, then the people around them that they love most will be hurt or maybe even die. So very high stakes, and the magic system, like I said before, is very confusing. I really do think it's a mix between sci-fi and fantasy because some of the magic seems based in technology, but with all that being said, Assassin of Reality is the sequel, so I won't tell you exactly what happens, but it does take place right where Vita Nostra left off. And it follows our same favorite main character, and it's a lovely ride. I will say I don't like it quite as much as Vita Nostra, but it gave me all the nostalgia that I was looking for Vita Nostra, and I just absolutely loved it. So I was okay that it wasn't as good as Vita Nostra. In reality, this is probably like a 4.5 star, but I don't do half stars, so it's a 5. So that is Assassin of Reality. If you've read Vita Nostra, highly recommend going to this. It's fantastic. So next up, we have a poetry collection, and there are actually 3 poetry collections in this list today. So the first one we have is And Yet. This is by Kate Baer, and it's published by Harper Perennial. I've read Kate Baer before. I love Kate Baer, so this was not a surprise that I loved this poetry collection. You can see more about it and the other 2 poetry collections that I'm going to talk about in a poetry vlog that I did earlier in the year for National Poetry Month in April. So I will put that video down below if you're curious hearing more. But this collection is kind of like slice of life, which is what Kate Baer typically does. She writes mainly like nonfiction poetry about her life. And this one centers around being a woman, being a mother, and also her relationship with her husband. And the relationship with her husband were probably my favorite poems. They pop up throughout the collection. And it does such a good job of showing how all-encompassing a relationship really is, and that you can't talk about a relationship holistically without talking about, you know, the good, the bad, and everything in between, basically. So she does a really great job of, I don't know, portraying a realistic view of what a long-term relationship looks like. And I absolutely loved that. Of course, I loved the stuff about womanhood and parenthood as well, which are very present in her previous collections that I've read. And yeah, I just adored it. So if those themes sound interesting to you, highly recommend. I think she's a great poet to get into if you're brand new to poetry. So yeah, absolutely loved that. So that is And Yet. Next up, coming in at number 8 for the year, is another poetry collection, and this is Alive at the End of the World by Saeed Jones, and it's published by Coffee House Press. I think this cover is amazing. It looks so cool, and I was very intrigued to find out what was inside and how the cover related to it. And this has a lot to do with grief. It's sort of centering the loss of his mother around many other themes, but grief is the overarching theme throughout the entire collection. And there's also a lot to do with race. There's some stuff about the pandemic in there. And I just loved all of it. I thought it was very interesting, the formatting of some of the poetry. Sometimes they were written sort of like sideways across the page, and the reasons why it was written sideways were related back to the poem itself. There was a poem that I loved that was all alternative titles for the poem that you had just previously read. And I thought that was fascinating, the way those two poems interacted with one another. I absolutely loved that. But yeah, if you've read Saeed Jones before, he has a memoir out. He has a complicated relationship with his mother, and that is very much filling the pages, and he's trying to come to grips with losing someone that you love, but also have a very complicated relationship with. So yeah, I think this was fantastic, and I highly recommend it if you're interested in the themes that I talked about. So next up at number 7, we're back to a novel, and this is Severance by Ling Ma, and it's published by FSG. This is an oldie but a goodie. Lots of people have read this previously, but I finally got to it this year. I was on like a string of reading some dystopian books all at once, and this was one of the ones that I read, and I thought it was great, just as everyone else said. It follows a woman who's like 20-somethings, maybe late 20s, something like that, and she is starting to go through what turns out to be a pandemic. She's in New York City, and it is so interesting to see the process of like starting to work from home and that being very new for everyone. And she's one of the only people still going into her office because they need like a skeleton crew. She also is one of the few people that stays in New York for a very long period of time as the pandemic is happening. And she is chronicling it through a blog that she keeps, and most of it is photos, but that's kind of a weird like historical artifact that you get to see throughout the book as well. And she then goes on some crazier adventures. So I won't say where the plot goes, but I will say the plot was freaking wild. I was not prepared for how wild the plot got based on what people had said previously, but this goes places, people. So be prepared for that. I was very shocked, but it's very page turning and exciting as you kind of like hit the halfway point with what's going on. So yeah, if you're ready to read about a pandemic, I think in a lot of ways it was very realistic. Of course, it's fictionalized and it came out before our pandemic, so it's not like meant to be accurate towards that, but there are a lot of eerie similarities, and it's really thought-provoking the way that it shows the stripping of rights, let's say, that starts to happen when people are living in fear. So yeah, I thought it was fascinating, really loved it. So many people have recommended it, but now I can also be a person to recommend it. So that is Severance by Ling Ma. Number 6, we have another beloved title, and that is Stay With Me by Ayobami Adebayo, and this is published by Knopf. It was one of my 5-star predictions, like a backlisted 5-star prediction, and it was definitely 5 stars. Man, this really has stayed with me. That was not an intentional pun on the title, but there it is. Longer than I thought it would. I read it at the very beginning of the year. I want to say maybe it was the first book I read this year. And it follows a couple very closely, but it's from the perspective of the wife. And she is struggling with infertility. And her husband, before they got married, they are Nigerian, and they had promised each other that they would not take additional spouses. And that was very important to them. And then because she is struggling with infertility, the husband is getting a lot of pressure from his family to take a second wife in order to have a child. And eventually he does take a second wife. And you know all that from the blurb, so that's not a surprise. And it just follows them through this process of a fracture in their relationship. There were already fractures because of the infertility that were happening, but now this has caused a huge rift between them when they previously had a great relationship leading up to this. So yeah, it really just follows the breakdown of a marriage, and I thought was very realistic, and the characters were very fleshed out. They felt very real, and they felt like they had interesting arcs going on, and their thoughts felt believable. And yeah, I think they did a great job with the characters. I will say this is another one where the plot goes off the rails. Like what? There's so many crazy things that happen in here that I was not expecting. Like in some ways, I'm like, this could be a thriller. Like there are aspects of this that are very thrillery that I was not expecting at all. So yeah, it was very surprising. I don't want to ruin anything for you, so it's also surprising for you, but absolutely loved it and think it was a great representation of someone going through infertility and the toll that that can take on a relationship and a family. So that is Stay With Me by Ayobami Adebayo. Next up, we have the last poetry collection on this list. And if you've seen the poetry videos, you probably know what my favorite poetry book has been so far this year. And that is Dog Songs. This is by Mary Oliver, and it's published by Penguin. This is nonfiction. It's the first Mary Oliver that I've ever read, and it is all about her love of dogs, specifically the dogs that she has had throughout her life, or the dogs that people who are very close to her have had, and therefore she has been in frequent contact with. Now, this, I think, part of why I loved it is the tone was so earnest, and that isn't something that I typically like in books, but I really loved it in this collection. I think earnest is a great way to describe dogs in general. They're just so unconditionally loving, and it really is just heartbreaking and heartwarming all at once how truly loving they are and how you can build a relationship with them. This also weaves in throughout humans' connections to nature and is trying to relate that back to dogs' connections to nature, and how they kind of let us into a side of nature that we wouldn't typically have access to. So I loved that as well because I love nature writing. And yeah, this just got me in the feels, man. Just got me in the feels. Made me think about my own dog. It has lovely illustrations. If you go back to watch that video, I show some of the illustrations in it. Yeah, it was absolutely fantastic. And if you are a lover of dogs, I would highly, highly recommend this collection. So we've made it to our top 4. So here we go. Number 4 is Happening. And that's actually the first one that I can show you because I have it right here. So I recently read this. I read this in June. This is by Annie Erneaux, and it's translated from the French by Tanya Leslie and published by 7 Stories Press. Everybody's reading Annie Erneaux right now for good reason, right? But she won the Nobel Prize last year for literature. And this is nonfiction. She mainly writes nonfiction about her trying to get an abortion in 1960s France when it was currently illegal. And her writing is very sparse. It's very factual. There's not a ton of adjectives peppering the pages. And I think for this story, which is very short, it works perfectly. It sort of shows the horrors of trying to get an abortion and how difficult that is for a woman and the trauma that you have to go through when you experience this. And by keeping it in such sparse prose, it really speaks for itself, right? Like, she is not doing anything to further elevate how horrific and graphic and tiring and exhausting and worrying it is, but it makes it more powerful because that is really just like, that's the experience. It's not being dressed up at all. Like, that's the experience. And it's so important to be able to read experiences like this. And yeah, I loved it. I got the hype. It makes sense. I think everyone should have to read this, and it will probably stay with me for a very long time. So that is Happening by Annie Erneaux. Next up at number 3, we have the other physical book that I'm going to show you, also one that I read in June, and that is Who Killed My Father by Edouard Louis. This is translated from the French as well, and this is translated by Lorin Stein, and it's published by New Directions. Look at this. Oh my goodness. Also very short nonfiction. This is a memoir, so to speak, by Edouard Louis that is focused around his father and his father's ill health and death, and the ways that he believes society and people in the government specifically are complicit in his death. And really, it's a take on classism in France. It shows that if you are poor in France, that the government will institute policies that have no impact on them, but have life and death stakes for you. And they really don't care about you, right? They will continue to exploit you for all that you are worth. And then you will have to deal with the consequences of that. So it was very brutal in its takedown of the government. It names names, like specific people over time who have enacted specific laws that have harmed his father. And the other thing that I really loved about this is his relationship with his father is very complicated. His father was not the best man, and he's very honest about that. It shows the ways that toxic masculinity have ruined generations of this family and caused so much pain and hurt, and also has a lot of compassion for that being the best that he could do. And I loved that. I thought it was just, I don't know, it's just honest, and in a way that would be very hard to be honest, and it's very vulnerable. So I loved this and think everybody should also read this. So that is Who Killed My Father by Edouard Louis. All right, at number 2, we have a book that I read much earlier in the year, and that is Milkfed by Melissa Broder. Again, lots of people love this, and for such good reason. I feel like this is the year where I went back to a lot of beloved books and absolutely love them myself, and Milkfed definitely fits the bill for that. So this one follows a protagonist who is struggling with an eating disorder, and one day they go to one of their favorite yogurt spots, and instead of the boy that typically works there, there is a woman who is in a larger body, and she is very effervescent and loves herself and is confident, and our main character is very drawn to that because she doesn't have it for herself. And they form a friendship that leads to maybe more. It also has some commentary on Judaism and the wide range of Judaism that we can see in the US in particular. So both of the female characters are Jewish, but one comes from a much more like devout practicing family and one does not, and sort of the contrast there that I thought was really interesting. And yeah, it's just also very sensual, and I loved that as well. I think I've heard this described as like the most bisexual book ever, and it is very bisexual in the best of ways. But yeah, it was so fun. Even though those sound like very hard topics, the tone was like a dark comedic tone, and I really enjoyed that. And also the representation of an eating disorder was just like fantastic. It was a really great depiction of what an eating disorder experience can be like, and I appreciated that. So yeah, I absolutely love this. I think it's very fun. The cover is amazing, so I add to the hype of this. Please read Milkfed if you have not already read it, and Milkfed is published by Scribner. And my number one book of the year, maybe you can guess it, who knows? Guess down below before I say it if you think you know what it is. But this book is The Wall by Marlen Haushofer, and it is published by New Directions. This is a reprinting that New Directions did. The book originally was written in the 60s, I believe, and this is all about a woman who one afternoon is at a hunting lodge. She's on vacation with a couple of friends, and she realizes that her friends have not come back from an evening out. And when she goes outside, she realizes that there has been an invisible wall that has erected around the property. She's not sure how far it goes on either side, but we come to find out that she is the only person trapped within this wall. And it's about her survival. And I will say, this isn't the most exciting dystopian ever, but for some reason I was so captivated by it. I could not stop reading it. I constantly wanted to get back to reading the book, and the descriptions were so vivid about the nature around her. I think because it was such a limited scope in the location that we were able to really imagine it in detail, because this is all she has left. So her little kind of cottage that she's staying in, the land that it's on, and then she also has a dog and a few other animals roaming around on the property as well. This was just absolutely fantastic. It's a very feminist novel, and it's talking a lot about the ways that women are forced into roles still today, but also back then, forced into roles that they might not necessarily want to be in, but they don't have other options. And so they find themselves being mothers and wives and all these types of things that are not for everyone. And she's really contemplating back on her previous life. She's keeping a journal, and that's what the book is supposed to be. Yeah, it was just so lovely to be with this woman for the length of time, I won't tell you how long, that we're with her, and to watch her be a badass and think back on her life and what was meaningful for her and what was not, just with brutal honesty. And I absolutely loved it. I think she's an amazing character. I could read about her all day long, and this is definitely my favorite book that I have read so far this year. I will be looking for more Marlen Haushofer to read, and yeah, I hope everyone else will read it, and I absolutely loved it. So that is my favorite book of the year, and all 10 of my favorite books of the year so far. So I will say there aren't a ton of new releases on here. There's a good amount of backlist, which I'm happy with because I tried to read a mix of frontlist and backlist. So please let me know if you have read any of these books and what you thought of them. I would love to hear what your favorite book of the year is so far, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye.